let's shift this over to philosophy. Last time I just took questions. If you want to, you could start that way, or I do have a very simple topic I was going to suggest to you. It could not be more simple. And again, I have to warn you, I'm just as prepared as I was the last two times, which means not. Sometimes people say this by way of trying to exhibit mock humility. I'm just telling you the facts, so whatever comes, comes. But I was thinking, just to keep you know the old story about you put all your notes down on a sheet of paper and then reduce them to what you can write in your hand, and then you forget what you reduced it to. But the one really simple note that I have for you tonight is a principle that goes all the way back to Parmenides. Of course, he's the fellow who came up with the idea of being. It was a little bit warped. I'm not going to go into his warping, but he did initiate the primary insight that everything really was about being. And he gave us this basic principle that from non-being, you get nothing. Being can only come from being. Non-being cannot give you being. I could go into how he was doing this, what he really meant, but that doesn't matter. I'd rather almost avoid the side avenue tonight, because that basic insight that you don't get something from nothing is absolutely fundamental. It is absolutely the starting point. It is the lever. It is the principle that you can use to solve virtually every question that arises in metaphysics, I dare say in philosophy, or in anything. It's just a matter of getting used to using it and realizing that it's there. So simple. From non-being, you don't get being. Being only comes from being. All of these other themes that you have studied with Dr. Waters or with any genuine philosopher are themes which are exhibiting that principle. When you talk about potency and act, what are you talking about? Act is being. Potency is non-being relative to being. You don't get act, you don't get being from potency, not by itself. You got to have potency, perhaps in a limited context, to be open to new being. But potency is on the side of non-being. It's what isn't. It's what you don't have. You can understand this very clearly if I were to say to you, and please don't chase me out of here to tar and feather me, but if I looked at you and said, you know, you folks strike me as some potentially intelligent people. Now, do you feel complimented? Not really, because what I just told you is that you're not intelligent, right? Now, actually, it is a compliment. I wouldn't say that to a group of canaries, because they're not even potentially intelligent. They don't have the capability of exhibiting intelligence, or have it, because they don't have intellects. But at the same time, saying that one is potentially intelligent is a way of saying that he is not intelligent. Potency is on the side of non-being, and that's why you can't just have potency and somehow miraculously get act out of the potency, because the potency doesn't have it to give it to itself. Real simple stuff. And by the way, just a little side point here, but it occurs to me, you read many philosophers, in fact you read many people in many orders, especially politicians, who explain everything to you in very complicated terms. You take a philosopher like Kant, he specializes in an abominable snow job. Huge words, you know. They're this big in English, they're this big in German. They never end, and you never know quite what he's saying. And since you don't know what he's saying, you know he must be really intelligent. And I dare say this is what happens with a lot of professors in universities. What they're saying is so complex that you're just overawed. But you know, and I know, the truth is that if somebody really knows what they're talking about, they can simplify it. It's not a question of bringing it down to somebody's level. It's a question of explaining it in terms that cannot be misunderstood. And what I'm suggesting is that if you really understand all of the philosophical or metaphysical insights, you can reduce them ultimately simply to being. You can because after all, what is this? The science of being as being. Is that this metaphysics we're doing? Okay, yes. This is the science of being as being. Everything reduces down to being. And in trying to explain the complexity, the change that we see in the world around us, we are constantly asking, what is its source? What does it come from? It can't come from non-being. Non-being doesn't explain anything. That, of course, is precisely why, for so long, as you well know, the scientists, the astronomers, the physicists, insisted that the universe was a steady state. They had the steady state theory, that galaxies and stars were constantly being formed and deformed, but always here. Because everybody understood from the word go that if at any time there was nothing, you'd have nothing now. They weren't metaphysicians, but everybody still had that natural metaphysics of human intelligence that told them they don't get something from nothing. And then, of course, along comes this Big Bang theory, and even major scientists like Einstein and others resisted it for a long, long time because it wasn't simply a matter of trying to avoid God, but it was simply unthinkable to them that the universe could have begun because it's here, it must have always been here. And of course, the moment you say that at one time it was not, and now it is, well, this has awesome implications, doesn't it? So they weren't about to say that. They went far longer resisting the Big Bang theory than the evidence would allow. They just couldn't bring themselves to accept it. But they were testifying at the same time to that universal recognition that from non-being you don't get being. Now you have, of course, some atheistic physicists like Stephen Hawking doing handsprings to try to somehow explain that before the Big Bang there wasn't anything in a way, but there was something. And if you simply, as it were, vibrate the non-being in one direction with the non-being in another direction, you get something. But ultimately, it still is metaphysical magic. You don't get something from nothing. And never forget that even when, say, these scientists, who are scientific materialists, make these kinds of claims, they can't do anything in their own discipline without using these metaphysical first principles that we're using. They can't account for any phenomena at any level. They can't describe it without presuming that there's some kind of explanation for it, or else they have to hang up their shingle and go home because they're out of business. You can't say you're a scientist and then stop giving explanations. And as long as you are giving explanations, you're attesting that this phenomena, this being, comes from something. It's explained by something. Now, of course, there are hundreds of ways you can play the principle. You can play it in terms of going through time. You don't go from non-being to being. You can also play it in terms of looking at the things that are around us today and asking, why do they exist? Do they explain themselves? Now here we start using the principle of sufficient reason. But what is the principle of sufficient reason? It just says that if you have being, you need to have a sufficient explanation for that being. You don't have something and it's rooted in non-being. Either a thing somehow explains its own being, or if it doesn't, to the extent that it doesn't, it needs something else to do it. So everywhere you turn, you have being in search of an explanation. Because, how do you know? Because you don't get being from non-being. You don't have being differentiating itself from non-being without sufficient explanation, that is to say, sufficient intelligibility to explain why it is not just nothing. The whole point of proofs for God's existence rests in examining finite being and realizing that to say it just is would be like saying you could have being from non-being. How do we know that? By examining finite being and seeing its deficiencies. Seeing what it can't explain. Seeing, above all, that it can't explain itself. By the way, anytime you've got a question, just stop me. You can't get me derailed because I don't know what I'm talking about. What was I talking about? Oh yes, being from non-being.
Why would you even want to study non-being?
Well, there's nothing to study. You might want to study it because it's a real simple course. If you're looking for, one of these courses you could take, get an easy grade. Take the philosophy of non-being. But you see, I'm dancing all over the place here. Look at the first way, the prima via. The proof for God's existence from changeable being. What are you doing in there? What's it all about? We start from motion. St. Thomas says, it is first and most evident to the senses that some things are in motion. First known and evident to the senses that some things are in motion. And then he explains what motion is. What is motion? Now, that's a fascinating notion itself. Motion. The act of a being in potency insofar as it's in potency. I'm struggling to remember this stuff. Well, what on earth does that mean? It takes some time to explain, but it amounts to something I'd rather not get into, but I guess I'm there. It isn't just the act of a potency, because the act of a potency is realized at the term of the motion. In other words, if I'm heating water from freezing up to boiling, when it's freezing, it's potential to be at boiling. When it's boiling, we've gone from 0 to 100 degrees Celsius, is it? Or centigrade, that's safer. But we're already at 100. That's in act. But that's not the motion of heating from 0 to 100. The motion of heating from 0 to 100 is not measured, let's say you get up to 50 degrees. It's not measured by being at 50 degrees because with respect to 50 degrees, you're already there. The motion isn't measured by the fact that it's now in act. It's measured by the act which is contained in the continuing potency to move to a higher level. In other words, it is the progressive increase in the temperature that you need to explain, not the already possessed temperature. The possessed temperature is already there. So the motion isn't what has already been accomplished, but rather it has to be understood in terms of something continuing towards an end. We have problem with our language because our words are always expressing themselves as motion. We say the reduction from potency to act, but reduction is talking about a kind of motion. So the definition of motion is difficult itself to understand because a definition defines something, it delimits it, it freezes it. But you're precisely in motion talking about what isn't frozen. You're talking about that whose activity is a continual realization of something new. It is continual newness. So it isn't as far as the temperature has reached, but rather it is the process of continually increasing that temperature. That is the motion. Now, when we say that a thing cannot reduce itself from potency to act, obviously, if something is at 0, it can't explain being at 50 because it's not at 50. If it's at 50, it can't explain being at 51 because it's not at 51. So when we talk about motion, any type of motion, we're talking about a progressive newness that is appearing in the finite order. And what we're really doing is asking, where does it come from? Because what you've got is continual new realization of being. There's something constantly being manifested anew, and you want to know where does it come from. Because it can't come from what was already there, because what was already there didn't contain it. If it did contain it, it wouldn't be new. The very fact that it's new means it isn't contained in what was there in the old state. You can look at this any angle you want, it works the same way.
With animals, then, do you use the soul to explain motion, or what's removing an animal from potency to act?
We're really not concerned with what it is that's moving them at this point, but rather that they don't completely move themselves. The soul, here's the problem, before the animal moves, it's still got a soul. But that soul is not animating an animal that is in the new position that it's going to take. And therefore, that soul lacks the activity of having the animal in the new position. Since it lacks it, it doesn't have it. If it doesn't have it, it can't give it to itself. It's got the same problem. In fact, what you're really doing in the prima via is just noticing the finitude of creatures. You're noticing, what does it mean to be finite? To be finite means, to be limited. It means again, being and non-being, it's beautiful. It means not having some being. It means you got the being you've got, but you don't have the rest of being. At this moment in time, you're all seated. Not one of you has his hand up. Now you do. But what I'm really suggesting, because the principle says you can't reduce yourself from potency to act, what I'm really saying is you don't have your arms up right now, and you can't put them up all by yourself. Why? Because right now, I know, wise guy puts his hand up. But the reason you can't put your hand, I didn't say you couldn't put your hand up. I said you can't put it up all by yourself. The reason you can't put it up by yourself is because you don't have it up. You don't have the existential perfection, the being of it being up. And because you don't have it, how are you going to give it to yourself? You say, that dodo, he doesn't know anything about muscles and tendons and nerve impulses, contracting the muscles, the brain emitting nerve impulses. Here's the difficulty. How are you going to get that all going? How are you going to get the muscle to contract when it's not contracted? How are you going to get the nerve impulse to move the muscle to contract when it hasn't been dispatched from the brain? How do you get the brain to dispatch it when the brain hasn't dispatched it yet? I'm trying to get you to focus on what it really means to be finite. To be finite means to exist exactly as you exist under these particular conditions of time, space, finitude, your being. There's no more to you than there is at this moment. If you are to move forward through time, that means that you're going to gain certain new qualities of existence that you don't presently have. And if you don't have them, where are you going to get them from? You don't have them. You really don't have them. That's what it means to be finite. So where do you get them from? You don't get being from non-being. With respect to whatever new qualities you're going to get in the next 2 minutes, even moving through time, you are non-being. You're being insofar as you exist right now, everything you've got, but you're non-being in reference to that which you're going to have in a minute, or a second, or a millisecond. And since you do not have those existential perfections, how can you give them to yourself? From non-being, you do not get being. That's why I said at the beginning, seriously, you can apply this to everything, and you must apply it to everything.
You're touching on the question I said I had a week ago.
Good. Good time to ask it.
And that is, I wanted to ask you, I think when most of us learn the first way, which is movement, even when we're taught it, say, in a high school apologetics book, we're kind of taught it in a kind of a deist manner, that God, years and years ago, got the whole thing in motion.
Yeah.
And then from that point gave us the potency to move. But what I learned in these classes is the fact that I'm talking now, that motion is coming directly from God being the first mover. And the question I have is, could you explain every link in that process? Because I can tell somebody that. But if they said, well, demonstrate it, prove it, I don't think I could.
Well, I must confess that many of the proofs for God's existence that I see do not overwhelm me. And one of the difficulties, as you say, is people tend to think in terms of, well, God initiates this whole thing from the beginning, gives things their operative properties, so that they then go on and act on their own. And they are secondary agents. And they do possess their own proper activity. That's why when you raise your arm, that's not God raising his arm. That's you raising your arm. It's your arm that gets raised, not God's. All I said is you can't do it all by yourself. Not all by yourself, but it's your arm that does it. It's your nature that is being put into act when you perform this activity. Maybe the stuff isn't quite as easy as it looks. But it certainly isn't a matter of going back through time. Going back through time isn't going to help anything. That only puts you into prior states where you lacked even the state you got now. You've got to explain how you got to where you are now. You've got to explain why you are the way you are now. But what I'm focusing on right here in the Prima Via is how you're going to get to the next state of being. How are you going to get to the next set of perfections that are exhibited by you passing through time and doing new things, changing in any way, shape, or manner. And you're quite right. You need a direct link to God. People don't realize how immediate the argument is. In fact, you don't even have to get into this question of infinite regress. I don't know where you'd find this, but actually I have an article published on this in Faith and Reason.
I could find it, actually.
When on earth did I write this? This was about
73 or something?
82.
82.
Something like around 82. And it's the subtitle is, I think the title is Why New Existence? The subtitle is something like a variation on this Prima Via of St. Thomas.
I looked it up once, but I didn't photocopy it.
Yeah, and they're about to go out of business.
But the seminary library still has it.
Right, yeah, it'll still be around. Yeah.
In a word, Doctor, would change be out of order?
Well, change is just, for most people, it's just another word for motion. Change means that you acquire some quality that you didn't have. Or perhaps you lose a quality you had. But whatever it is, it's very real. That's the point. It's real. Look at it in these terms. Think of it in terms of the difference between the old and the new. I use the example, and I've given this to you before in an earlier lecture, but here I want you to see how we apply the non-being to being principle. You know how in motion pictures we create the illusion of motion by taking the frame that's got a picture on it, and we make a slight change in the next frame. And then you very quickly substitute the next frame for the prior frame, and suddenly there's something new there. Well, the problem is that we are, as it were, contained in the frame that we're in at the moment. And if you're going to explain change, the difficulty is that the prior frame doesn't contain the quality that's different in the next frame. So where's it going to get it from? It's easy to explain in motion pictures because you've got another frame. And you've got that little shuttle mechanism that comes out and grabs the sprocket on the side, moves it rapidly, and you don't notice it. But that's not what's going on in reality. In the real world, we are what we are, we have what we have, and for anything to change at all, you got to get something new. Now, the standard materialist explanation is, it's the same old stuff. You just rearrange it. It's basically atomism would say you've got all these fundamental particles in the universe, and they're all just swirling around, exchanging states constantly, moving one form here to another one there, moving one part of energy from here to another part over there, exercising one influence on this, on something else over there, causality operative, natural laws operative. They explain the whole thing. The problem is, they don't. They don't explain. It's just like the example of frequently that's used of inertia. Why does a body in motion stay in motion? In other words, if you're trying to explain why the universe continues to operate the way it does, a materialist would often simply say, well, you've got all these particles and they're moving around and they're just banging into each other and doing new things. And everybody knows that just like a planet, if it's in motion, it keeps moving until it bumps into something else. And that explains all the changes.
But that's not an explanation, that's an observation.
Exactly. Even Sir Isaac Newton, who came up with a principle, was the first to say, or I don't mean the first to say, but he was quick to say, that this did not fully explain it. He posited that when you've got a body in motion, there's got to be some other principle that explains why it stays in motion. St. Thomas was so confused by this that he suggested that a projectile, like a rock, when you throw a rock through the air, why does it keep going? Why doesn't it stop? And he hypothesized that what happens is the air gets in front of it and rushes around behind it and propels it forward, keep it going. He didn't know a beans about the physics of it, but he knew something had to do it. Newton said that there was a universal principle that did this. The problem is, as you correctly pointed out, that all that Newton was doing was observing that it's a fact that bodies in motion tend to remain in motion. That doesn't say why. Why do they do it? Why do they do it when you look at it metaphysically? Every time they move, they're gaining a new state of existence. Now, it doesn't mean that you've got a new planet or a new atom, but what it does mean is that the planet or the atom has a new position in space and in time that it didn't have before. And what we're asking is, hey, where'd that come from? You reduce it to just a change of position, just an accidental change, nothing substantial. But where does the change come from? Where does the new position come from? Why is it new? Being new precisely means it's different than it was before. There's something there that wasn't there before. It's occupying a new position in the space-time continuum, if you want. But that means there's a difference between the new and the old. And all that we're saying is, following that principle, you don't get being from non-being. Where's the newness come from? Where does it come from? You say, well, it was already there. It was there in the... Okay, if it was there in the old, then why didn't the old contain the new? If the new is really different than the old, and I presume it really is, because after all, these materialists are explaining all the changes of the entire cosmos, of evolution, cosmology, astronomy, anything that's ever been, they explain it by just saying, well, it's the same old stuff getting rearranged. Then will you please at least give me the due of admitting that the rearrangement is real? And the rearrangement does make a difference? Because if it doesn't make a difference, then Parmenides was right. Nothing's going on, folks. There is no change. Change is an illusion. Motion's an illusion. If there's anything these materialists believe in, it's in progression. It's in evolution. It's in becoming. And if they believe in becoming and they reduce it just to rearrangement of the stuff that was there, will they at least do us the courtesy of allowing that the rearrangement is real and that it does make a difference? If it does make a difference, we're talking about an existential difference. It's a difference in being. It's a difference in the way something exists. It may only be a matter of position, but you're explaining the whole universe by those changes. So you better allow that they're real. And if they are real, then that means what is new is really different than what's old. If it's really different, then it's got being that wasn't there before. And we're just saying, where's it come from, folks? Where's it come from?
Are you going to tell us?
No. Just kidding. But you derailed me by asking me. Now I don't remember. What was there before? Remember, we're talking about a finite universe. We're talking about a universe where everything's limited to being just what it is. And that's the problem with you folks having your arms down. Because since they're down, you can't lift it by yourself. You say, well, somebody else could come over and help me lift it. Yeah, but how is he going to lift his arm to help you lift your arm? He's got the same problem. His is down. In other words, in reference to anything coming to be in the universe, everything is finite. Everything's limited to the prior state. Doesn't have the new perfections that are going to be realized by the change. So where's it going to come from? If you're dealing with a universe of merely finite beings, you've got no explanation. There is no source. But it remains true that there is nothing new under the sun. It remains true that you don't get being from non-being. The problem with a finite universe is everything is non-being in reference to newness. Everything's limited to being just what it is, just like everybody in this classroom. We're all stuck being just where we are, doing what we are, being what we are at this moment. We don't fill the whole vacuum here. We aren't doing 1,000 things at once. All that is non-being. But it could become being because we're potential to that. But potency doesn't explain anything by itself. The only way to explain that there is newness in the universe is there must be some being that exists which already possesses every quality that is possible to realize. Otherwise, it never could be. God himself is not exempted from his own principles. The principle comes from God because he is the ultimate being. It's his principle of being, so it's derived from him. But he, of course, lives and is according to his own principle, which is himself. So God himself could not produce new being because, of course, outside of him there is no other being. That's not a problem. It's not a limitation for him. But as far as the world of finite beings is concerned, you need to have some kind of an external principle that does have already the qualities of existence that are manifested whenever change occurs, so that those finite beings can participate in, can receive. They've got a place to get these qualities from. That doesn't mean that God is a being that has an arm that's down and then it's up, or that he's got arms and they're always up. What it means is we have arms, and whatever existential perfections are manifested by having an arm up, whatever that means in the space-time continuum, in terms of whatever it can do, God is providing the actuality of that perfection and the actuality of every possible perfection in the universe, even those that never get realized, because they pre-exist in him. God is, as it were, a universal donor of existence. Typo, negative. And notice, no infinite regress arguments, no causal chains, no intermediate causes here. You don't need them.
Dr. Aldrich at Canisius told me that you should, instead of thinking of God as being at the beginning of a causal chain, you should think of him as pulling things, like instead of motion being a kind of push, it's really like a sort of pull toward actuality.
That would be to think of God as a final cause. And God is indeed a final cause. But you still need an efficient cause to explain the actuality that is being produced. And that's what's missing from that metaphor. You've still got to have God actually producing the perfection that is expressed as my arm is raised, or as anything that comes to be. You are pouring being into that thing. Not what it's already got, because it doesn't need to add to what it's already got. You still need to explain why it's got what it's got. That's a different argument. But whatever is about it that is new, that belongs to the prima via. It's the newness of the universe that needs to be explained. And the finite universe, because it lacks all these qualities of existence that it doesn't yet have, and which it manifests as it goes through time and motion, gaining new qualities of existence, that finite universe can't possibly explain the source, the being, the content of the newness that it is constantly expressing. It can't do it by itself, just like you can't raise your arm by yourself. This applies to the individual, it applies to the whole cosmos. It applies to everything, even angels. You need to have an unlimited being, a being that possesses every possible quality of existence, to stand as that universal donor to explain what becomes new in every finite being when change occurs. So, see that? Go ahead.
Okay, now I understand what you're saying. But
That's better
if you
than
were
I
to
do.
explain this to scientists, get in an argument with them, could you really use that argument and have them understand it? Or would you try to argue it on some other type of level so that they could understand it?
Depends on the scientists you're dealing with. Some are more
But
perceptive
you
than others.
get into arguments
Right.
with scientists. And,
They
what you're saying, of course, is, I don't know, they probably need hours to sit and listen to what you're saying.
you'd be amazed what they don't understand. I mentioned to you before this Darwinian evolutionist that I was dealing with, and he was trying to prove that the principle of non-contradiction didn't work at the submicroscopic level, but he clearly had never thought about the fact that he was using some of these metaphysical principles at the submicroscopic level to describe what was taking place at the submicroscopic level. So frequently they have not reflected upon these metaphysical insights that they are naturally using because they're human beings. They can't help themselves.
If we're looking at the will, I was in a class not long ago with this guy giving a presentation on the brain and neuroscience, and he seemed to be like a biodeterminist and saying that it's all chemistry. Would you use the same sort of argument to explain the motion of the will, that it can't go from
Potency to act. It doesn't
by
do
itself?
it. No, it doesn't do it all by itself because God has to move it in some way, but He moves it according to its own nature. Just as when you raise your arm, it isn't God's arm being raised; it's yours. So when your will is actuated, it's still your will and your choice, not God's.
Because even if you'd had just the chemistry, the question would still be what makes it go, right? What starts the brain chemistry in any particular direction?
I'm sure they would have a hard time discerning any possible interference by the will by using normal methods of scientific observation. You're going to kind of hit a moot point there
Right.
in any discussion. But the principle, when people question or doubt the principle that we're using here, one example I often would give to students is, what would you think if we got to the end of the course and you thought you were doing quite well and you opened your report card and found you got an F? And you come to me and you say, what happened here? I thought I was doing better. You were doing fine. Well, why did I do so badly? Well, did you make a mistake when you wrote out the report? No, it just happened that way. Well, why did I get an F? Well, no reason. These things just happen. I don't think any student would accept that.
I copied from the guy next to me all semester long, and he didn't get it out.
No student would accept that and dare say, at anybody that you're dealing with, including these scientists, are going to be absolutely adamant about explaining what they're saying, what they're doing. And they'll never let you get away with just saying, that's the way it is, I don't have an explanation. And they'll jump all over you. Why? Because they know you've got to have an explanation. Nobody gets away with that. But at the same time, some of them will sit there with a straight face, as this one I was dealing with, and say, maybe the whole universe is just a brute fact, and there's no explanation. He just disestablished himself as a scientist or a human being to be taken seriously. It is impossible to continue intelligent dialogue once somebody says something that's stupid. There's no place to go. Now, you can continue to use the principle anywhere, everywhere. If I had the time, and we don't, I would show you how you could use it to show the real distinction between essence and existence in finite beings. How do we know that essence and existence are distinct? You'll see explanations that are frequently given based upon the De Ante Essentia chapter 4, the man and phoenix argument. You can conceive of a man or a phoenix, but one's real and the other isn't. That causes all kinds of confusion and difficulty. There is, to my mind, a better way, which St. Thomas alludes to further down the paragraph, in which you simply compare two beings and notice that if they really are two, one's got something the other doesn't have. If one's got something the other doesn't have, then there's got to be a principle of difference. There's got to be a reason why one has it, the other doesn't. And you can play that off to show that all finite beings are composed of essence and existence, to show that all beings are composed of essence and existence, except perhaps the possibility of one. That's another argument for another evening. Do you have any other?
If the universe is finite, science says that on the Big Bang Theory, it's continually growing.
It's exponentially expanding, in fact.
Continuously growing.
Yeah, they found out that the Hubble constant is now has to be interpreted as indicating that we are having progressive one-way expansion. They thought for a long time, you'd expand and then contract. But they found out when they started observing it in recent years, it's not only not contracting, it's expanding at an alarmingly increasing rate. which all the more indicates that it's a one-time only show. But that's for the scientists. We don't need to go there. As metaphysicians, you don't need to go there at all. Okay, any other questions? I do have to stop now. Thank you.
This recording is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.